December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At 7:48 a.m., the tranquil morning air above Oahu was shattered by the roar of 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft. In a matter of hours, the United States Pacific Fleet lay crumpled and burning in the shallow waters of the harbor. The world watched in absolute shock as the American naval presence in the Pacific seemed to evaporate overnight. For the planners in Tokyo, the mission was a tactical masterpiece designed to paralyze the American giant and secure resources without interference. They believed they had bought years of dominance. But they overlooked a critical detail that would ultimately seal the fate of the empire. While the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma were being turned into steel coffins, the United States Navy's most vital assets were nowhere to be found. The aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea on ferry missions. This stroke of luck prevented the total annihilation of American striking power, but it did not change the grim reality. The United States was suddenly a secondary naval power in a theater defined by vast oceanic distances. The era of the battleship, those heavy-hitting icons of the early 20th century, had ebb in a firestorm. The new queen of the seas was the carrier, and the United States was starting the race with a massive disadvantage. By early 1942, the situation grew even more desperate. The Japanese juggernaut seemed unstoppable as it swept through the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The American Navy, forced into a defensive posture, had to gamble with its few remaining carriers. In May, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the USS Lexington was lost, a devastating blow. Only a single month later, at Midway, the USS Yorktown was sent to the bottom after a truly heroic struggle. By the time the campaign for Guadalcanal was in full swing, attrition reached a breaking point. The USS Wasp was sunk in September, and in October, the USS Hornet was lost at the Santa Cruz Islands. There was a moment in late 1942 when the United States had only one carrier, the USS Enterprise, left to face the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. Sailors famously hung a hand-painted sign on the hangar deck that read Enterprise versus Japan. To any observer, the math was impossible. Japan had spent decades building a professional naval air arm and modern carriers. They believed the industrial capacity of the United States was a myth that could not be mobilized in time. They anticipated a short, sharp conflict where American resolve would crumble after a series of decisive defeats. But the Japanese leadership fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the adversary they had awakened. They saw the loss of ships as a permanent reduction in force, a subtraction from a finite total. They did not realize that for the United States, the early losses were the catalyst for a global transformation. The sinking of the Lexington and the Hornet ignited a fury within the American industrial complex. While the black smoke was still rising from the wrecks in the Solomon Islands, the slipways in places like Newport News and Brooklyn were already buzzing with fanatical intensity. The early blows of the war were a brutal education. The American military learned that bravery alone could not win a war of attrition against a prepared foe. They needed numbers, innovation, and speed. The loss of dominance was a period of vulnerability, a time when the fate of the democratic world hung by a single thread. Yet, it was during these darkest hours that the blueprint for victory was drawn. The United States realized they had to outproduce the world, turning the ocean into a massive conveyor belt of steel. This period reminds us how quickly power shifts and how fragile a superpower can be. The charred and twisted remains at Pearl Harbor and the lonely vigils of the Enterprise were the prologue to an industrial miracle. The legacy of these early losses is the realization that a nation's strength lies in its capacity to lure, adapt, and rebuild from the ashes. The Japanese struck a blow they thought was terminal, but instead provided the spark for a fire that would consume their empire. Ultimately, the American response would be defined by the relentless tide of ships they were about to build. June 14, 1940, in Washington, D.C., the United States Congress took a gamble that would ultimately rewrite the rules of naval warfare. While the smoke of the fall of France still hung over Europe, the Vincent Walsh Act was signed into law, authorizing a staggering 70% increase in the size of the U.S. Navy. This was not a modest upgrade or a routine modernization. It was a declaration of industrial intent. Known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, it provided the legal and financial framework to build 18 aircraft carriers and hundreds of supporting vessels. Long before the first bomb fell on Hawaii, the blueprint for Japan's defeat was already being drafted in the accounting offices and drafting rooms of the American government. This legislation was the master key that unlocked the vault of American industrial potential, turning a nation that was still shaking off the dust of the Great Depression into a manufacturing titan. By the time President Franklin D. Roosevelt took to the airwaves for his famous fireside chat at 9 p.m. on December 29, 1940, the transition from a peacetime economy to a war footing was already in motion. He coined the phrase arsenal of democracy, a term that would define an era of unprecedented productivity. Roosevelt knew that the coming conflict would not just be a test of bravery on the front lines, but a contest of factories, supply chains, and engineering audacity. The challenge was immense. At the start of the 1940s, the American shipbuilding industry was a relic of a bygone era, characterized by slow, handcrafted methods that took years to produce a single capital ship. To win a global war across two oceans, the United States had to treat the production of a 30,000-ton aircraft carrier with the same assembly line efficiency as a commercial automobile. The man who would bridge this gap was Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship in his life. Kaiser applied the principles of mass production to the shipyard, breaking down the complex anatomy of a vessel into modular sections. Instead of building a ship from the keel up in a single dry dock, different components like the bow, the bridge, and the hull sections were prefabricated in workshops hundreds of miles inland. These massive pieces were then transported to the slipways and joined together like a giant puzzle. This required a fundamental shift from traditional riveting to the revolutionary use of electric welding. Welding was faster, required less specialized labor, and created a lighter, stronger hull. Old-school shipwrights were skeptical, but the results were undeniable. Construction times that once stretched over 3 years were slashed to less than half that time, and eventually, the American workers would be launching ships faster than the Japanese intelligence services could even track them. This industrial mobilization was not merely about raw materials. It was about the total reorganization of American life. By early 1942, the War Production Board was established at 10 a.m. on January 16 to oversee the total conversion of civilian industry to military output. Car manufacturers stopped making sedans and started making aircraft engines. Washing machine factories pivoted to producing shell casings. The American workforce transformed as millions of women and minority workers stepped into roles previously denied to them, filling the shipyards of Richmond, California, and the docks of Newport News. This human element was the fuel for the machine. The Legarie Essex-class carriers, which would become the backbone of the future Pacific Fleet, began to slide down the ways with terrifying regularity. While Japan struggled to replace even a single lost carrier hull, the United States was laying the keels for dozens at a time. The scale of this achievement was underscored by the development of the Independence-class light carriers. Recognizing that the large Essex-class ships would take time to reach the front, the Navy ordered the conversion of 9 cruiser hulls already under construction into fast carriers. This flexibility was the hallmark of the American response. They did not just build what was planned. They adapted their industrial might to meet the immediate crisis. By the time the sun set at 6 p.m. on any given day in 1942, thousands of tons of steel were being shaped into the very instruments of Japan's destruction. The Japanese High Command had gambled on a short war because they knew they could not win a long one against this industrial colossus. They had hoped to break the American will at Pearl Harbor, but they had only succeeded in waking a sleeping giant, whose heart beat with the rhythm of 1,000 forge hammers. The legacy of this period is not found solely in the statistics of ships launched or planes built. It resides in the fundamental shift of global power that occurred when a nation decided its survival depended on outthinking and outproducing its enemies. The legislative foundations laid in 1940 created a tide that no amount of tactical brilliance from the Imperial Japanese Navy could stem. It was a victory of the shipyard as much as the battlefield. Looking back, we see that the true miracle of the American response was the belief that the impossible could be manufactured through collective will. The twisted steel of the Pacific was met with the fresh, gleaming hulls of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, proving that while a fleet can be sunk, the industrial spirit of a mobilized democracy is an unsinkable force. The ships were the physical manifestation of a promise made to the future, a promise that no matter the loss, the arsenal of democracy would always provide the means to reclaim the horizon. January 1941, Newport News. Virginia witnessed the beginning of a transformation that would rear the traditional methods of naval construction obsolete. While the Imperial Japanese Navy treated each of its fleet carriers as a bespoke work of art, crafted with artisanal precision over many years, the United States was preparing to turn the shipyard into an assembly line. The centerpiece of this industrial revolution was the Essex-class aircraft carrier, a vessel designed not just for the rigors of combat, but for the demands of mass production. The previous era of shipbuilding dictated that a vessel must be built from the keel up, with every rib and plate fitted individually by master shipwrights in a single crowded location. But as the clouds of war darkened, American engineers realized that to win a conflict across the vastness of the Pacific, they could no longer afford the luxury of slow, meticulous craftsmanship. They needed a fleet that could be birthed in sections, forged in the fires of the American heartland, and assembled with the speed of a modern factory. The genius of the Essex class lay in its modularity. By 9 a.m. on any given morning at the Bethlehem Steel or Newport News yards, thousands of workers were already deep into a rhythm that resembled a choreographed dance of fire and steel. Instead of waiting for the hull to be completed before starting on the internal compartments, the Navy began subcontracting massive components to inland factories. Steam turbines were built in the Midwest, while enormous brass propellers were cast in the Great Lakes region. These components would arrive at the coast by rail, ready to be dropped into place. This meant that while the keel was being laid in the dry dock, the pilot house, the galley, and the engine rooms were already being constructed miles away. This revolutionary subassembly technique allowed for a simultaneous construction process that slashed production times in half. The design of the Essex class itself was a marvel of standardized engineering. Unlike the earlier Yorktown class, which had been constrained by international naval treaties, the Essex was built with one goal in mind: total air superiority. At 872 feet long and displacing over 27,000 tons, it was a massive platform designed to carry more than 90 aircraft. Every inch of the ship was optimized for the speed of the deck cycle. The inclusion of a third elevator on the edge of the flight deck, rather than just on the center line, meant that even if the deck was fouled by a crash or busy with launches, planes could still be moved from the hangar to the sky. By 2:30 p.m. during a high-tempo shipyard shift, one might see a massive crane lifting a prefabricated 50-ton section of the bow into place, where it would be welded into the existing structure in a matter of hours. The human element of this industrial miracle cannot be overstated. With much of the traditional male workforce enlisting for combat, the shipyards were flooded with a new generation of workers. Thousands of women and unskilled laborers were trained in specialized tasks like overhead welding and pipe fitting. These workers didn't need to know how to build an entire ship, they only needed to master their specific module. This specialization drove efficiency to unprecedented heights. By 11:15 p.m., Under the glare of massive floodlights that turned night into day, the sparks of 10,000 welding torches would illuminate the skeletons of multiple carriers being built side by side. The pace was relentless. In 1941, the average construction time for a fleet carrier was nearly 3 years. By the height of the war effort, the yard at Newport News managed to launch the New Yorktown CV-10 in just over 16 months. When the news of these production speeds reached Tokyo, it was met with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. Japanese naval planners had calculated their strategy based on the assumption that the United States could only replace its losses at a trickle. They believed that a decisive battle would cripple the American Pacific Fleet for years. They had not accounted for the fact that for every carrier they sank, the American industrial machine was preparing to launch 4 more. The Essex-class became the physical manifestation of a nation that had successfully industrialized the very concept of naval power. By the time the war reached its climax, 24 of these behemoths had been ordered, and not a single one was lost to enemy action, a testament to both their rugged design and the sheer volume of defensive fire their modular hulls could support. The legacy of the Essex-class fleet extends far beyond the tactical victories at the Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf. These ships represented a fundamental shift in the way humanity perceived the limits of production. They proved that the collective will of a mobilized democracy, supported by the cold logic of modular engineering, could outproduce any centralized autocracy. The Essex carriers were more than just floating airfields. They were the high water mark of a civilization that had learned to manufacture victory on a conveyor belt. As we look back on those steel giants, we see the blueprint for the modern world, a world where the speed of innovation and the power of assembly remain the true measures of a superpower. The rattling of the rivets and the roar of the shipyards provided a symphony of defiance. A promise that while a single ship might be temporary, the industrial spirit of a free people is an inexhaustible resource that will always find a way to reclaim the horizon. August 1, 1943, the Central Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy High Command sat in their briefing rooms, staring at reconnaissance photos that seemed to defy the laws of probability. They had spent the previous year locked in a brutal war of attrition, believing that if they could only sink enough American carriers, the United States would eventually sue for peace. But as the summer sun beat down on the waves, a terrifying truth began to emerge. The Americans were no longer just replacing their losses. They were expanding their fleet at a rate that made Japanese production look like a cottage industry. The gap was no longer a crack in the door. It was a chasm that was swallowing the rising sun whole. The Japanese strategists had calculated their moves based on the bloody lessons of 1942. They remembered the fires on the Lexington and the sinking of the Hornet. They believed the American spirit would be broken by the sheer cost of naval warfare. However, as the clock struck 9 a.m. at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, the harbor was not a graveyard, but a bustling hive of preparation. The arrival of the first Essex-class carriers changed everything. These were not the rushed, pre-war designs modified for combat. These were purpose-built predators of the deep, designed for the mass production of destruction. By the time the invasion of the Gilbert Islands began in late 1943, the scale of the mismatch was undeniable. Admiral Chester Nimitz now commanded a force that would have been unimaginable just 12 months prior. At 2:45 p.m., during the height of the planning phase for Operation Galvanic, American officers looked at maps of the Pacific and saw not just islands to be conquered, but a logistics chain that stretched back to the assembly lines of Michigan and the shipyards of Virginia. This was the moment the war shifted from a contest of tactical skill to a contest of industrial endurance. The Japanese had managed to launch a handful of carriers during this period, but they were hampered by a desperate shortage of raw materials and a shortage of trained pilots. In contrast, the Americans were churning out thousands of Hellcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. It wasn't just about the ships, It was about the synergy of the entire machine. While a Japanese shipyard might take years to complete a single hull, the American yards had mastered the art of modular construction. They were building sections of ships in different locations and welding them together in record time. As the first waves of the 1943 offensive crashed against the Japanese outer defense perimeter, the realization among the Japanese leadership turned from concern to sheer horror. They were fighting a ghost fleet. When the new USS Yorktown and USS Lexington arrived in the theater, the psychological blow was as heavy as any bomb. To the Japanese sailors, it seemed as if the very ships they had sunk at Midway and the Coral Sea had risen from the depths, resurrected by a power they could not comprehend. This was the strategic shock of 1943. It was the realization that even if the Imperial Navy performed perfectly on the battlefield, the factory floors of the United States would simply overwhelm them with volume. The Americans had created a conveyor belt to victory. By 3 p.m. on any given day in 1943, more tonnage was being launched in American harbors than Japan could hope to produce in an entire year. This production gap was unclosable. It meant that every Japanese pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every ship sunk was a permanent wound, while American losses were merely temporary setbacks on an ever-accelerating timeline. The Japanese had prepared for a samurai duel, a singular moment of decisive battle where skill and spirit would prevail. Instead, they found themselves caught in the gears of a massive, heartless machine that cared little for individual heroics and everything for the relentless logic of the assembly line. As we look back on this pivotal year, the legacy of the 1943 offensive reigns a testament to the terrifying potential of a fully mobilized society. It redefined the very nature of superpower status, moving it away from the romanticized notions of military tradition and toward the cold, hard realities of industrial output and technological innovation. The unclosable gap was not just a matter of steel and oil. It was a manifestation of a nation's collective will to transform its entire economic identity into a weapon of war. The lesson left in the wake of those massive carrier task forces is one of both awe and warning. It tells us that the ultimate strength of a nation lies not in the weapons it possesses at the start of a conflict, but in its capacity to adapt, to build, and to outpace the horizon of its own limitations. The steel giants of 1943 eventually faded into the mists of history, their hulls scrapped or turned into museums, but the blueprint they established remains. It is a reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, the true measure of a civilization is its ability to engineer its way out of the darkness, turning the rattling of the rivets into a song of survival that resonates long after the guns have fallen silent. The horizon they reclaimed was not just a geographic boundary, but a testament to the industrial spirit of a people who refused to be eclipsed. In the final analysis, the strategic shock of 1943 was the moment the world realized that the future belonged to those who could manufacture it. The waves of the Pacific still carry the echoes of that realization, a haunting reminder that while bravery is the heart of war, production is its relentless pulse. The gap that Japan could not close remains a monument to the fact that when a nation decides to forge its own destiny, there is no factory in the world that can produce a shield strong enough to stop them. It was a victory of the shipyard as much as the sea, a triumph of the worker as much as the warrior, and a legacy that continues to define the balance of power in our modern world. October 20, 1944, off the coast of Leyte in the Philippine Islands. The horizon was no longer a thin blue line but a jagged wall of grey steel that stretched beyond the curvature of the earth. For the Japanese observers watching from the heights of Samar, the spectacle was both terrifying and impossible to reconcile with the reports they had been fed by their own high command. They had been told for years that the American fleet was in retreat, shattered by the attrition of a 3-year war and the superior spirit of the Imperial Navy. Instead, they looked out upon the most powerful naval force ever assembled in human history. This was the arrival of the United States' 3rd and 7th Fleets, a concentration of naval air power so immense that it rendered the very concept of a balanced engagement obsolete. It was the moment the world realized that the industrial engine of the United States had not just replaced its losses. It had redefined the scale of naval warfare entirely. By this stage of the Pacific Campaign, the American naval presence was a geological force. The centerpiece of this absolute dominance was the Essex-class aircraft carrier. At the start of the conflict, the loss of a single deck like the Lexington or the Yorktown was a strategic catastrophe that left the entire West Coast vulnerable. By 2 p.m. on a typical day in 1944, a new hull was sliding into the water at a shipyard in Virginia or New Jersey, destined to join a fleet that was already bursting at the seams. These ships were not mere replacements. They were the vanguard of a new doctrine. Each Essex-class carrier brought with it nearly 100 aircraft, advanced radar suites, and a density of anti-aircraft fire that created a literal iron umbrella over the task force. This was the birth of what sailors called Murderer's Row, a line of carriers so formidable that they could launch hundreds of fighters before an enemy scout plane even crested the horizon. This was the era of Task Force 38, or Task Force 58, deeping on the admiral in command. It was a massive, rotating armada that could strike with the concentrated fury of over 1,000 planes and then vanish into the deep blue, only to reappear 1,000 miles away 48 hours later. The Japanese High Command had long dreamed of a decisive battle, a singular clash where they would lure the Americans into a trap and destroy their carrier strength in one blow. But as the campaign for the Philippines began, they faced a terrifying reality. You cannot trap an ocean, and you cannot destroy a fleet that grows faster than you can sink it. The sheer number of American flight decks meant that even if a Japanese strike was successful, it was mathematically irrelevant to the outcome of the war. The logistical backbone of this supremacy was perhaps even more impressive than the carriers themselves. In the secluded waters of Ulithi Atoll, the Americans had constructed a floating base that defied logic. At 10:30 a.m. on any given morning at Ulithi, a sailor could look out and see 15 carriers, dozens of battleships, and hundreds of cruisers anchored together in a single lagoon. This was Service Squadron 10, a mobile city of repair ships, floating dry docks, and supply vessels that allowed the carriers to remain at the front for months on. They did not need to return to Pearl Harbor for repairs or replenishment. The American factory had effectively moved to the enemy's doorstep, ensuring that the pressure on the Japanese defense never relented for even a single hour. While Japan struggled to find enough fuel to train a handful of replacement pilots, the United States was graduating thousands of aviators every month. These men arrived at the front not as desperate recruits, but as highly disciplined professionals flying the F-6F Hellcat and the SB-2C Helldiver. These aircraft were technologically superior and backed by a search and rescue network that valued the life of a pilot as much as the plane itself. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf reached its climax, the disparity was so profound that Japanese pilots realized their only chance of hitting a target was to turn their own planes into missiles. The rise of the kamikaze was the ultimate admission of industrial and tactical defeat. It was a desperate attempt to use human spirit to compensate for a total lack of steel and sophistication. In the final year of the war, the carrier groups moved with total impunity. They launched strikes against Tokyo and the naval bases at Curie at 8 a.m., 11 a.m., and 3 p.m., maintaining a relentless cycle of destruction that the Japanese home defense could not break. The American carriers were no longer just fighting. They were conducting a siege from the sea. They had transformed the Pacific into a private highway for American power, proving that the reach of a nation is limited only by its ability to produce. When we reflect on this overwhelming carrier strength, we see more than just a military triumph. We see the birth of the modern world where the carrier strike group became the ultimate expression of national will. The sight of dozens of carriers sailing in formation was a message that the era of the battleship was over and the era of mobile air power had begun. It demonstrated that a nation's true strength is measured by the efficiency of its assembly lines and the depth of its resource pools as much as the bravery of its men. The legacy of those steel giants is found today in every carrier that sails the world's oceans, serving as a silent deterrent and a floating piece of sovereign territory. The lesson of the shipyard victory is that while battles are won by those who fight, wars are won by those who can rebuild, and return with a force so great that the enemy's only option is to watch the horizon and wait for the inevitable. It remains a poignant reminder that in the face of such absolute industrial resolve, the bravest defense is often just a footnote in a story written by the forge, the flame, and the relentless pulse of production. This was the moment the world learned that once the engine of a free nation is fully engaged, there is no storm on earth that can capsize the sheer weight of its destiny. September 2, 1945, in the shimmering, sun-drenched waters of Tokyo Bay. As the heavy silence of history settled over the deck of the USS Missouri, the world looked on at a scene that would define the next century. The signing of the Sura documents was a formal to the relentless bloodshed, but the true testament to the victory was visible for miles in every direction. Surrounding the battleship was an armada so vast it seemed to stretch into the very horizon, dominated by the towering islands and expansive flight decks of the Essex-class aircraft carriers. These ships were not merely platforms for war. They were the physical manifestation of an industrial miracle that the world had never seen before and likely never will again. To the observers on that day, the message was clear. The war had been won in the factories as much as on the waves. When the conflict began, the United States was a nation still finding its footing in the shadow of the Great Depression. But by 3 p.m., on any given day in 1944, the American industrial machine was operating at a cadence that defied logic. In the shipyards of the East and West Coasts, the rhythm of construction never faltered. A new shift would begin at 4 p.m., bringing tens of thousands of fresh workers to the hulls, their torches flickering like stars against the darkening sky. This was the heartbeat of a nation that had decided it would not be outproduced, outfought, or outlasted. While the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself paralyzed by the loss of a single carrier, the United States was launching replacements with a frequency that felt like an assembly line. This was the echo of the forge, a relentless sound of hammers and rivets that resonated across the Pacific, signaling a permanent change in the very nature of global conflict. The profound reflection we must take from this era is not just about the ships themselves, but the changing face of global power they represented. Before the first steel was laid for the new carriers, the world was a patchwork of competing empires and regional powers. But the mobilization of the American forge transformed the United States into a global titan. The aircraft carrier became the ultimate symbol of this new era. It was a mobile piece of sovereign territory, capable of projecting power at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. with equal devastating efficiency. This capability shifted the paradigm of defense, proving that the most effective way to ensure peace was to possess an industrial capacity so great that any challenge to it would be a fool's errand. The carriers were the vanguard of this new world order, moving cities that carried the hopes of the free world on their decks. Japan's shock was not just born from the tactical defeats at sea, but from the realization that they were fighting a shadow that grew longer with every passing month. They had calculated a war of attrition, but they had not accounted for a nation that could treat the construction of a 20,000-ton warship like the manufacturing of a common automobile. By 11 a.m. on the days when new carriers were commissioned, the celebrations in the shipyards were not just for the military, but for the bakers, the teachers, and the housewives who had all played a role in the ship's birth. This total societal commitment created a resilience that was unbreakable, It remains a poignant reminder that the true strength of a nation is found in its unity and its ability to channel its collective energy toward a single existential goal. As we look back at the legacy of these steel giants, we see more than just the machines of war. We see the birth of the modern world, where the ability to innovate and produce at scale became the primary currency of influence. The forge has long since cooled, and the great shipyards have largely fallen silent, replaced by the digital pulses of a new age. Yet the lessons of that era remain etched in the history of the waves. The victory was a story written by the forge, the flame, and the relentless pulse of production. It tells us that while courage is the spark, industrial resolve is the fuel that keeps the flame of liberty burning. The final thought we must carry forward is one of deep respect for the sheer scale of human effort. The carriers that sat in Tokyo Bay on that September morning were the messengers of a new age, carrying a weight of destiny that changed the course of humanity. They proved that a nation's greatest defense is its ability to build a future, even while the storms of war are at their most violent. The echoes of the forge remind us that we are the heirs to a legacy of resilience, and that the true measure of power is not just the ability to destroy, but the capacity to rebuild, return, and remain. The horizon will always hold new challenges, but the story of how a nation replaced its lost carriers so fast serves as a permanent beacon, showing that when a free people are united in purpose, there is no limit to what they can achieve. This was the moment the world learned that the engine of a free nation, once fully engaged, is the most powerful force on earth.